Finance and an early stage company is a very lonely place. You generally don't really have a team. Maybe there's 1 to 3 people. One of the things that generally CEOs miss out on is this idea of like, how do the other leaders translate what their goals are into some like financial number or strategic number? Generally, a VP of finance with experience can help them bridge that gap. Whereas a head of finance is going to need some of that experience and kind of nurturing to get to that stage. So I think from a strategic scope, someone more senior is generally much more helpful. The best businesses in the world know how to structure teams in their roles. And it's just generally not always based off of merit. It's also like the personality and the individual and the type of role. The thing that a lot of people miss is setting expectations very clearly with individuals. A lot of folks come into a startup just think like they're going to do everything every time. Like that's not how you should orient to any role. Like setting expectations through an interview process, the 30, 60, 90-day kind of bridge is very critical for anything.
We had a great conversation with Aman Samra, the VP of Finance at Spellbook today. Spellbook is one of the most interesting companies in AI right now. It's pretty much them and Harvey that are really pushing the boundaries of what's possible with agents and using AI in different workflows in the legal space. So super interesting company. And then Aman himself is very interesting because he was the first finance hire now at 4 different startups, had an accounting background before that. So came from a very traditional career path and then really made his way in being this like first guy that you bring in at a startup to lead up finance and all of the things that go into that. So a lot of great stuff to learn from his journey into tech, into startups, and the work they're doing at Spellbook. So excited for you guys to listen in. Well, cool. Thank you for coming. I'm going to run through your background here. So I'm like looking at your LinkedIn profile. You started out, did accounting in school. You went to BDO, which I know of. I've like been trying to figure out how to do something before compliance related and landed on some of their blog posts. Then you were at RSM. It's like a mid-market Big Four type firm, right?
Yeah, pretty much like top 6. And then you got the Big Four and then BDO and RSM fall right under them.
Yeah, that's kind of was my understanding. So you do like school, accounting, intermediate accountant, like accounting consulting at RSM Canada. And then you go to startups. You're in like finance and strategy at BioConnect, which looks like it was like a biometrics SaaS solution. Pretty early stage company. You joined there. Looks like pretty early too, because you helped them raise money. Yeah, that's pretty cool. And so then you jump to a company called Sampler. And as their, I'm assuming first or like very early finance hire, you joined there as a finance lead. This is a marketplace for consumer product experiences for brands. So you join there. It's a marketplace, different type of business model, early finance hire. And then you bounce to Resolve, which is an interesting company because they're in the buy now, pay later space, but for B2B companies. So like B2B commerce. And you joined there as head of finance. And then most recently you joined as VP of finance at Spellbook, which is one of the most interesting players in AI right now, actually, because I feel like it's like you guys and Harvey who are like really doing interesting things in like the like AI SaaS, AI legal space. And so we'll talk about Spellbook more in a second. And then you've done some fractional CFO work. But I think something that's interesting about all that is one, you started out very traditional, like accounting. Like honestly, you could have probably made the whole career in like Big Four type accounting work if you wanted to. Then you made the pivot to the startups as an early finance hire, which I think is a really interesting career path. And you've done it now 3 or 4 times, if you like all the way up to Spellbook.
So I've been 3x first-time finance hire. My first role at BioConnect, I had a VP of finance, but it's basically number 2. So I've been early at every startup I've been at.
Hell yeah. So you've done a bunch there. Yeah, that's crazy.
So it's awesome to hear like you've had so much experience being the first hire. Usually I've founded companies in the past. I think in the beginning, financials of any company is pretty easy, right? You just got to have record keeping, audit trail, approval for securities, maybe just basic systems. Whenever you've come in, right? What do you think the founder is looking for whenever they're trying to figure out their first finance hire?
Yeah, I think the big thing with anyone going into like an early stage company, it's really dependent on one, I'd say the CEO and kind of their mentality of the hire that they want. Typically what I would say is like an early stage finance hire is not going to be your traditional accountant, not going to be your traditional IB or like super in tune with finance, that type of person. Really, what I'd say is more optimal for this kind of role is more of a generalist. The reason why I say that is there's this element of continuous like evolving at an early stage company. And so if you're really, really deep in your career into one niche of finance or even accounting per se, I generally say you lack skills that are transferable in an early stage company because a lot of the processes are not set in place. And I think a lot of people tend to be super surprised at how bad some of the accounting or like the books or just the processes generally are. And so it's kind of like a culture shock or just like a shock in general for a lot of these folks. And so when I typically talk to individuals that want to go into these roles, I would say expect the unexpected because no day is really going to be the same. And you're going to have to get deep into like the manual stuff, like paying bills, small journal entries, stuff that you typically might not do if you're more senior in a later stage organization. So I think more so like you need an operations focused individual. And I think more CEOs are probably looking for that type of background, that type of trait. Someone who's open to kind of adapt to a startup environment. It's culturally a fit around the idea of, hey, are there ways we can optimize, scale, grow? You really need that growth mindset, which a lot of public accounting firms or investment firms tend not to have. A lot of things are structured in most cases. So in my case specifically, when I was transitioning into the world of startup, I just hated accounting. I couldn't do the same thing over and over and over. It was becoming so mundane, but I think some of the foundational principles I obviously learned are super applicable to any like startup or first kind of role within finance. But yeah, like you want to have that growth mindset. You want to explore, meet other people, learn from their experiences. And so if you're that type of person, like I don't like the cliche of like type A, kind of describing that as kind of the archetype. But I would say, like, generally speaking, that first finance hire is usually a generalist that has the most success within that role.
So I have a follow-up question on that. I like know a lot of people that have done these more almost like a junior early finance hire. I feel like it goes two ways. Either they're like almost like the first finance person's more senior, like you bring it up into finance out of the gate, or you bring in someone super junior that kind of does finance and ops. And I guess there are stages in between, but that's the two routes I've seen most commonly with tech startups. Does someone need to have like a finance or accounting background at all to be the first finance hire at a startup?
No, I think, again, like having some background in accounting is definitely beneficial. The reason why I say that is accounting, generally, as you scale, there's more complex relationships between the financial statements and how you want to present your statements. There's ways, obviously, we know you can kind of manipulate the way financial statements look like. And if you know and understand the relatability between those three financial statements, you're obviously at an advantage. And I think one thing that a lot of people underestimate is that first time audit that you have to go through. A lot of folks who don't come from an accounting background will struggle mightily with that aspect. It's a hellhole in terms of compliance, but it's just mandatory. And a lot of investors are asking for that. So I would say like you do have an advantage somewhat from an accounting perspective. But in today's world with data being the most key ingredient to understand how your business is performing, especially in an early stage. If I look at an early stage business, all I care about is cash, is my runway kind of projecting the right way? Are my leading indicators in terms of my acquisition channels? Am I resourcing and allocating capital correctly? A lot of that actually is more biz ops. It's not really traditional finance. And so I say like a lot of people who are having success in their roles in finance now actually come from a data background and a kind of a biz ops background. The reason being is like you can, one, work with a lot of data. So having that background, maybe in SQL or whatever, really does help. Most biz ops roles tend to come from startup world. So you can generally translate maybe a Series C, B kind of skill set in biz ops back into maybe a Series A finance role. Very applicable. And two, a person in biz ops also has the benefit of being very cross collaborative with a lot of other teams. And so just think of your role if you're coming from a traditional accounting space. You really just work with accountants and maybe a variety of different customers or clients, but most of them are going to be niched within one space. If you're an IB, it's kind of the same thing. And so that cross collaborative environment, which is very critical in terms of understanding how do I resource product? What are my engineers thinking about? How do I think about sales and marketing and how do they work together? BizOps is generally the glue between that in terms of operations. Not to say like you don't need a finance background and need to grow into it, but I'm seeing a lot more individuals just for traditional BizOps roles growing into the role of a VP of finance or something like that.
Aman, you're speaking my language, man. Like everything you're saying, I feel like just 100% like hit the nail on the head. In the past couple of years, I feel like finance hires have become more external facing, right? Whether it's around different teams. or even investor facing, especially as capital becomes more and more scarce. I think traditionally everyone thinks of that finance hire just being siloed, building out some Excel sheets and hopefully the books balance. So dude, like 100% same page. What I am super curious about though is whenever you're talking about like, let's say biz ops team or finance team, like however we want to define it, how do you start thinking about potential structure? Because I think with the super generalist role and as you continue to scale, you do start adding like operational accounting, FP&A, and you start getting to some of the weeds of the finance department.
Yeah. So I'll maybe give an example of how I'm thinking about it in terms of Spellbook. We recently hired an accountant. So that individual is going to take the capacity off of my plate in terms of the accounting role specifically. So I'll actually like go back a little bit. So I break it down into a leadership role, which is generally your VP of finance. And then it tends to basically be around biz ops, rev ops, you got accounting, and then eventually you might want someone in FP&A. So those are kind of like the three major buckets. In terms of the leadership role, like the VP of finance, this is the individual that's going to oversee the finance team, is the right-hand person to the CEO. So your role is essentially to run all strategic projects, develop trust with the CEO, making sure you have the ability to zoom in and out of kind of viewing the business and understanding kind of what the drivers are. So holistically, you're kind of like that control center for finance. Within finance, of course, then you need some additional decision makers. So I'd say like generally a VP of finance should be more of a generalist who's really able to talk to different teams and work with different departments. And then if you think about hiring, I would generally say you want specialists within those specific fields. So one of the critical roles is accounting, making sure your books are controlled and you close it out, right, on a kind of monthly basis. So we just hired an accountant to take on that role. We had an external bookkeeper, wasn't really working out. Time to close was way too long. And so optimizing for getting someone in-house, increasing our turnaround time for month end, just having more accuracy around the books, someone to do the day-to-day management of finance, which a lot of people underestimate how much time actually goes into that. It just made sense to go in-house. So you got the role of an accountant. That's their kind of role. And they're also going to help you establish yourself to be audit ready. So it's a very critical piece. Then I'd say, like we talked about this earlier, is a biz ops person, someone who is more data oriented, can work with like data tables, can build a data stack, that type of thing. They'll really give you real-time visibility into your KPIs, your leading indicators, that type of information, because a lot of this is going to go, again, feed back into your budget, your forecasting, your scenario planning, the kind of decision making all these other leaders need in order to do their day-to-day. And then you got the last piece, I would say, is usually FP&A. I generally tend to say you don't really need FP&A until maybe like Series C stage. The reason why I say that is like you can get a lot of these expertise or kind of automated reports through a biz ops hire. And I generally try to keep my teams relatively lean because I know for the most part, like if I have my biz ops person and controller or accountant work together, they can establish and create some capacity to work on FP&A material. So I don't generally hire for an FP&A person until like we're really more complex and there's a lot more IR and investor relations stuff to manage. So my teams generally stay pretty lean until like Series C.
Interesting. So the structure I'm hearing is like, so this is almost like when it's like complete, your finance team structure is like you've got a senior finance person that's kind of leading things like head of finance, VP of finance, whatever. You've got the operations biz ops person that's more data oriented. I guess like biz ops, rev ops, it can have different titles, but someone owning that piece. You've got the pure accounting person making sure the books get closed. And then eventually at some point you add in like FP&A, but that's usually probably towards like a later stage. That makes sense to me. I think one thing I am like curious about is I actually feel like these things kind of evolve. Like at most startups, like my company, we have bookkeepers that we outsource to. I've worked with fractional CFOs before, but otherwise, like to the extent there is finance, it's like one of my jobs that I do, I'm sure, very poorly. And then I feel like it seems at some point somebody gets hired in, but like, what do you typically see as the normal life cycle of like finance is entirely being done externally to finance and accounting is entirely being done internally? What's the typical way that this evolves?
Yeah, I think the inflection point is usually around Series A. And so pre-seed to seed, most of the focus, again, is going to be on developing that product market fit. There's not much in terms of revenue, probably not much transaction, not much customers to really take care of. And in terms of investor related requests, it's not that complicated. You might have a few seed investors. You may have raised like $3 to $4 million, that type of thing. It's not too complex and your team size is relatively small. So in terms of managing, forecasting, kind of like the day-to-day financial operations, you can generally outsource that and someone can kind of support that. You probably need 30 hours a month in finance for that specific role. As soon as you hit Series A, that's typically the point in which I usually say you've reached some sort of PMF. And now you have to structure the business in terms of making it repeatable and scalable. And as soon as you involve repeatability and scalability, that's when the numbers start getting more complex. And you have to understand like $1 in terms of like a paid ad equals how much in dollars of revenue. And especially if you kind of relate it back to this environment that we live in today, we don't live in the 0% interest where you can just raise money anytime, any day. It doesn't exist anymore, right? So fundraising gets also much more complex. And so having someone internally to kind of support that transition and the complex day-to-day view of the business and obviously optimizing for those drivers and understanding that, that's where I usually say you need an in-house finance hire. There's also this kind of pressure now from investors, typically around that Series A stage when you raise a larger sum of money, that they don't want to get screwed over. And, finance people generally have a fiduciary responsibility of making sure the company is in a good spot, but also reporting the correct and accurate numbers. So I think there's two things. Like generally speaking, a lot of companies back in the day probably would push this towards like Series B. And most finance hires who would come in would just have to deal with like basically a huge pile of shit because it's a huge mess. It's not clean. The books are all fried up in the sense that, nothing actually ties out, that type of thing. The processes are very weak. The internal controls are very weak. There's a lot of processes to develop around that Series A as you scale revenue. And so I would say that's the major inflection point. And obviously with new pressure around our general like startup environment with all the fraud and all that stuff that we've seen a few startups obviously create, investors are obviously way more open to the idea of having and wanting. And then one point on a fractional CFO, I would say fractional CFOs are either really good or really bad. And so you have to be kind of really focused on who you pick. And we can get into this if you like, but that role specifically can really set you up for either success going into Series A or a complete disaster. Because again, a CEO is going to really rely on this fractional resource. They're going to be focused on obviously building the business. But since a finance person is usually the right-hand person to the CEO, relying on fractional resources is something I usually try to say be cautious of.
So you're saying if I raise $20 million, someone's going to be like, okay, we should have a real finance person around, not just Andrew managing all of this.
Yeah, 100%. You should. Like, just think about the incentives and alignment. Like a fractional CFO has multiple engagements, multiple clients. They're incentivized going after the largest billable customer. Not so much, hey, like, are you the best like potential or I like working with you type of thing. It doesn't work that way. Whereas an in-house person obviously is incentivized to work fully for you. And so they're laser focused on making sure your business is safe and all the other kind of structural stuff is around. Yeah, a fractional CFO is also not going to spend their time doing like the nitty gritty stuff. So you're probably going to have to hire an external bookkeeper or one of their team members as well to do a lot of that work. So it becomes complicated from that standpoint in terms of managing it.
So then what is a good fractional CFO? Like, how do you find one and what does that look like in practice?
Yeah. So one thing, make sure, especially if we're working in tech, make sure they come from a tech background. You'd be surprised at how many teams or founders hire fractional CFOs that come from large corporate environments that have never, ever dealt with a cash burn business or have no understanding of SaaS, like working with different engineering teams, how to resource against it. If you think about large scale companies and finance people within those organizations, they're generally only working on a subsidiary of that entire conglomerate. They don't really get pure visibility into the entire business. And so the decision-making process that they go through is significantly minimized in terms of the entire scope and strategy of the business. So I would say, make sure you find a fractional CFO that has experience with early stage startups, or at least your industry specifically, because they understand the language. They understand like the business is going to burn money. This is how we should manage it. This is how we should forecast. that type of thing. Second, I would say is like you really want to test this individual out prior to making any decision around hiring. Make sure you get your testimonials. So I generally say back channel as much as you can in terms of getting the right experience. There's a lot of horror stories of folks using bookkeeping companies, fractional CFOs, just because if they have positive testimonials or like marketing is done great. And so the reflection of that company is like awesome, but internally they can be an absolute mess. So back channel as much as possible in terms of understanding who these individuals are. You want to work with someone who is very open and receptive to the structure and strategy that you have. The whole role of this fractional CFO is not to apply your type of style of finance to the organization. It's to take the mission, values, and structure of where that business wants to be and design something related to that. So if you're having a lot of pressure from a fractional CFO saying, no, this is the only way it's going to be done, this is how we should do it, that's a red flag to start off with. Like, they have to be receptive to the ideas that you have, and they have to think about finance from that perspective. And I would say the last piece is like, don't go for an individual that's going to gouge you in terms of like billables, that type of thing. Generally speaking, find someone who's going to be on a retainer, not hourly, because you can't track and manage those. And I would say you don't need anyone who has like 50 years of experience or 30 years of experience, and they're going to charge you like $500 an hour or whatever the rate is. You can find a lot of skilled individuals for half that cost, and you'd be surprised how well they actually do.
Yeah, I feel like a thing I've seen go wrong, and I picked this up from a couple of my friends in the space too, is like folks that even if they know tech, but like say you're like a usage-based billing model, and they've like never done anything with like usage-based pricing or something like that, and they just try, it's oftentimes like not going to work unless you get someone that is just like flexible and can kind of like work with a broad range of people. Or on the flip side, if all your accounting firm, your controller ever does is like very simple annual recurring SaaS, like no complexity to the billing model at all, it gets messy. I'm curious, like, so you've been early finance hire a few different companies. When should I, like, say for me, and things are going well, a year or two, I'm looking at making my first finance hire. How would you think about whether or not I hire someone that's more junior, that's like, hey, you've got some finance experience or you've done some ops, you can probably pick up the finance stuff. But someone like that, almost like biz ops in finance, versus a little more like someone like you who's got more experience, and it could be like a proper head of finance, VP of finance, something like that.
Yeah, I think it ultimately comes down to the scope of the role and how you want to define it. A lot of companies either distinguish between like a head of finance, which is, I would say, equivalent of a senior manager, versus like a VP of finance who has a bit more experience hiring, building a team, that type of thing, and maybe working with the board. So a lot of this is going to come down to, again, the CEO and perhaps some of the investors in terms of how senior you want this individual to be. But I generally say like it goes back to the CEO. Like, what is your kind of goal at the end of the day for this individual to come in? Is it just to support around the day-to-day finance role, give you more insight around how we're doing cash flow forecasting, creating a budget, that type of thing? So are you leaning more towards just more of a day-to-day operational finance individual? Or do you need someone to really come in and reflect on the business, really look at from a strategic lens, saying, no, we should be allocating capital in XYZ area versus this. Also have maybe an opinion on their past experience and how to apply different strategies and processes, that type of thing. So really, again, it comes down to scope, and the CEO is the individual who knows, because they're generally talking about finance with most investors in the early stage, and they're trying to shift some of those priorities. So if the CEO still wants to manage the day-to-day strategic piece, which I generally say don't, because as a CEO, you have way too much going on. Hiring someone senior generally does work out pretty well. And I think it depends on the complexity of the business as well, the business model. It's very hard for a junior person to perhaps go into a role, or a fintech, for example. So my last company, Resolve, was a fintech, buy now, pay later, completely different than SaaS. A SaaS model is pretty easy to pick up, right? It's, monthly subscriptions, annual subscriptions. It's not rocket science. A fintech where you have multiple different implications, multiple different banks, you're dealing with a facility, you're dealing with GMV, take rates, there's a margin, a spread between how much you kind of borrow and how much you charge. That's a pretty complex business. And I would never suggest to anyone to have someone junior within that role, unless maybe that person's like worked in fintechs forever. that type of thing, and just really understands the business model. So I guess like there is a kind of discussion to be had around the business itself and how complex it is. If it's a SaaS business, again, you're looking for just someone to do the day-to-day management. You can get away with a head of finance or senior finance manager. But generally speaking, I would say like start looking a bit more senior. You don't need a CFO. CFOs come in like Series C, D, that type of thing. And a lot of the work they do is more capital markets specific, right? Trying to get you to the IPO or like through an acquisition, that type of thing. But I'd say like VP of finance is going to be your like gel for the most cases, and helps a lot of the other leaders view finance as being important or how to understand their numbers. Whereas a head of finance probably doesn't have those skill sets. So one of the things that generally CEOs miss out on is this idea of like, how do the other leaders translate what their goals are into some like financial number or strategic number? Generally, a VP of finance with experience can help them bridge that gap. Whereas a head of finance is going to need some of that experience and kind of nurturing to get to that stage. So I think from a strategic scope, someone more senior is generally much more helpful. But again, it depends on the CEO.
Word. I feel like for whatever reason, I'm thinking of like PayPal. PayPal had like a 24-year-old CFO or something like that when they went public. So I guess, which as you were talking, I'm like, man, on paper, it almost doesn't make sense to have a CFO that young of a business as complicated as payments. But I guess every once in a while it works out. But I think one thing too on this like junior versus senior thing is I feel like that first finance hire, that relationship with the CEO matters a lot. Like, do you trust this person? But for you, I'm almost curious, like when you're looking at gigs, you've done this a few times now. So when you were looking at Spellbook, for instance, how do you think about like, do I think I can work with the CEO? Are they going to respect me? Is this going to be a good fit? Like, how did you think about that?
Yeah. So I would say the first thing within the role of finance, like generally you have to establish that trust and earn that respect as a finance person. The CEO is kind of giving you the option to build and have the autonomy. So in terms of evaluating the role, like when I was kind of exploring my next option, I'd spent the last 2 years in SF, wanted the experience of a US company and what that looked like, that culture of building a startup. But ultimately, I want to go back to Canada and support a Canadian company and try to help boost our own tech ecosystem. So that was like the number one driver for me in terms of the scope of why I was looking. Two, I would say when you're evaluating a more senior role, like a VP of finance role, I generally kind of look at three things. Are you going to be the point person in terms of the finance, or is the CEO involved in every decision? Do you have the autonomy? Most people, especially in finance, and when you want to get senior, you want to have the autonomy because that's how you're going to develop your skills, but also how you're going to learn how to communicate different aspects of the business. If the CEO is kind of managing that aspect all the time, you effectively become more of a head of finance, right? You're just doing what the CEO said and just translating that into a model or whatever. So when I was going through the interview process, a lot of the questions centered around like, what's your leadership style like? What do you want? Again, really diving deep into what we talked about before, the scope of the role and what do you want out of this? And so a lot of what Scott mentioned, who's our CEO, was I need an individual to really be my trusted partner to kind of help us get to this next stage. Like AI changes super quick. So within 6 months, I don't want to be the one managing how our strategic lens works in terms of finance. I really need someone to take this on. And the other thing is just maturation in terms of finance processes and helping the external team and external leaders effectively, again, translate their strategy into some sort of number. And so you kind of go through that interview process, you get an idea of what the goal is and orient it towards that. The second piece would be, is there just a general open and transparent environment for communication, right? A lot of what the finance person does is actually, again, talk to different stakeholders. So prior to ever making a decision around his finance role, I generally talk to the existing leaders and making sure that they have an understanding of what their goals are, like how they think about finance or what they're struggling with. It gives you an idea of what their core pain points are. And I think the last piece is like, can you develop visibility and influence across the organization? The reason why I say this is like finance at an early stage company is a very lonely place. You generally don't really have a team. Maybe there's 1 to 3 people. And most of the time, you don't really get interactions with a lot of the junior folks. It's usually just the senior folks. So establishing like visibility and kind of trust across the org as like that finance person is kind of be the most important thing. And so are there going to be ways for you to effectively maybe present to the company or do those activities where you can establish yourself as that finance leader? I think that's very critical, and most people don't think about it, because visibility across the organization and just establishing yourself as a leader is very critical, I should say. But having that shared vision and alignment on those company goals is important. And so I think, you have to kind of go into these layers. It's almost like peeling an onion, just like continually peel back and see what this company's true culture is. And if it orients well with your goals and where you want to be, then it should generally be a good choice. I generally say avoid this decision-making process around, this company is going to go IPO or that type of thing. If that's your North Star, you're already doing the wrong thing. The whole point of working at a startup is to grow and excel and learn. If you're optimizing for like money or monetarily gaining just because there's a chance of IPO or they're coming off a big raise, that's when you're going to fail, or that's not the right person to hire.
I mean, I agree with that, but I think a lot of people who join startups are pretty ambitious, right? Mm-hmm. Like, let's say you're the head of finance, you get to more junior, like finance operators, right? Trying to balance, for lack of a better word, the egos between a couple of different folks who are trying to advance what you're saying, trying to be visible within the organization to prove themselves as like a finance leader can definitely put you or someone else in a sticky spot. Like, how do you balance not only, of course, like getting great technical talent on board, but making sure you're hiring the right cultural fits when it comes to the finance like division?
Yeah. So I give the analogy of like you're the general manager of your own department. And if you think about any kind of general manager, like of the sports team, not necessarily all type A or like superstars work well together. So you really need to think about the design of your organization and the fits in terms of the type of individual and kind of style and work and how they do things will fit into the overall scope of finance. So I'll give you an example of like an accountant, right? I'm not orienting that role around someone who's like the most ambitious individual in the world in terms of when I hire and view this role. I'm looking for an individual that is, one, comfortable with doing repeatable work because it is a repeatable job. So if you kind of look at someone who's very ambitious, they're going to get bored really quickly. So that's not a good fit. The second thing is, like, are you giving them a roadmap if they are very comfortable with accounting? Are you giving them a roadmap with growth optionality of like getting exposure to FP&A or them being on the roadmap for a controller, right? I think the thing that a lot of people miss is setting expectations very clearly with these individuals. A lot of folks come into a startup just think like they're going to do everything every time. Like, that's not how you should orient it any role. Like, setting expectations through an interview process, the 30, 60, 90 day kind of bridge is very critical for anything. And so within this accounting role, we just hired one recently. I set the expectations like within the year, I want you to become the controller of the company. This is the roadmap you need to establish yourself on in order to hit those milestones, in order to get to controller role. And while going through the interview process, we are very, very kind of expressive around the idea that this is a repeatable role where you're going to continually do the same things. Are you comfortable with that? Yes, yes, yes. There's an optionality for growth, which is something people want within a startup. Okay. And then biz ops. Now, this is where I want maybe a more of an ambitious individual. The reason being is that this individual ties more into the strategic lens of the business, forward looking. And so if I look at that, I don't just generally want someone who's going to be comfortable within their role. I need someone who's curious and can kind of tie the numbers, but also say like, have we thought about this? And so that's where the numbers and the role orients itself around how you think about and how you hire. So that's kind of how I think about hiring. It's just generally like a lot of startups, and I think we've gotten into this like whole world of merit hiring and all this kind of crap. It generally doesn't reflect well in most orgs. Personally, to me, it's just a bunch of crap. You know how startups are. Like, there's all these new models, like all this kind of like new flavor of the month type crap. And so I think the best businesses in the world know how to structure teams in their roles. And it's just generally not always based off of merit. it's also like the personality and the individual and the type of role.
I have so many hot takes on that. Well, I literally I have a lot of people angry at me on Twitter right now because it's a slightly different topic than this, but I tweeted something yesterday about the number of like 22-year-olds like DMing me about chief of staff jobs at my startup is insane. That's a separate career point, but I also think like this flavor of the day thing with like just everybody tweeting about like, oh, we only hire for merit. And it's like, well, what were you doing before? It's almost like reverse virtue signaling is what it feels like. So, but in the past, when I've been at companies that were kind of somewhere in the scaling vector, I actually think you bring up an interesting point that in startups, everyone's talking about merit, ambition. We need ambitious people. We need people that want to do shit. But sometimes you actually do need to hire someone who's okay with like, just you're going to plug in, you're going to do this thing and it's going to be repeatable. And are you okay with that? And I don't think this gets talked about enough. I've seen it where it's like, if you hire that ambitious person who just really wants to work at your company and it is a repeatable job, they're going to be really unhappy.
Yep.
And it may actually end up being a really bad fit for the exact reason almost no one in a company thinks it would be a bad fit. And then I've noticed that you kind of touched on that people don't talk about enough. I am curious, finance versus accounting. I feel like it's a bit of a stereotype that you could make that accountants are less ambitious. Do you think that is generally true? And when do you see maybe not be the case?
I would generally say like, again, it depends on the individual at the end of the day. If I reflect on my career as an accountant, I know I couldn't do it. I couldn't see myself within that role more than 3 years or something like that. And again, I would say like a lot of accountants tend to be comfortable where they are. And that's nothing wrong with that. They do great work and they can fit in any organization long term. Where I see the advantage of an individual being in finance, for example, is like a lot of them are type A individuals because that's generally the culture around finance. Because you have to make a name for yourself. You have to do something extraordinary. Otherwise, you're not going to really move up within the world of finance. From an accounting perspective, I would say, though, if you kind of grow your role within accounting, you start realizing a lot of the role becomes a sales job, not so much the technical piece. So if you find an individual or you are an individual who is starting to bring in a lot of clients and are orienting yourselves towards the sales type thing, or that's kind of what you're good at, that's maybe an individual that would be very well suited for coming into a startup environment because you know how to talk to people and you know how to convince people that you are the right, product or service or whatever it is, and or like you know how to sell value, which is a very critical part of a VP of finance or a leader. So I think, again, there's a lot of different flavors of accountants. There's individuals that will stay in the role and kind of just do the technical piece. And then there are folks that really tend to orient themselves towards, I want to become a partner or like senior manager. But in order to do that, you need to sell and bring in money.
Totally.
And so that's what I would say. Like there's generally two types of accountants, in my opinion. And those who are oriented towards like bringing in business, very extroverted, that type of thing, can be very well suited for our startup.
A weird thing I almost noticed with like we've recruited a lot of folks that at some point, even recently maybe in the past, were in the Big Four. And the thing that I picked up on during that process that was like a commonality, if someone even remotely was interesting for the role, was did they like leave whatever, either a part of the Big Four or just leave entirely, like within like 1 to 2 years. Like you're looking for the people that just jumped at a certain point.
Yeah.
It's almost like they couldn't take it because they were like, they wanted more than just the traditional like up the ladder path, I guess. On this point, like I'm going to slightly pivot a little bit because I know we're close to time. But one thing you touched on earlier, talking about Spellbook, that I actually think would be an interesting thing to kind of talk about towards the end here is the gross margins and cost of acquisition. And I actually think like one interesting thing right now for anybody building in software, that software is historically like this really, really high gross margin business. But I actually feel like with AI, that's like, it's still potentially high gross margin, but maybe not always as much because there's like even more compute costs to large language models than there are to just like pure play SaaS. You've got some cloud hosting costs and that's about it. I'm curious, like your experience today at Spellbook, like how has that shifted how you actually do think about your costs and then building that up into like what you can afford to spend in acquiring customers?
Yeah. So let's talk about gross margins in general. So yeah, like you mentioned it, like traditional SaaS companies just had compute as mainly their COGS. And you could generally say you have an 80 to 85% gross margin. A lot of these AI companies have an LLM as kind of the back end, which tends to be pretty expensive and it's going to impact your gross margin. So a lot of startups within the AI space are typically ranging from like 60 to 80% gross margin because of that. Now, I think the distinction here is with LLMs, it really comes down to kind of the business model and kind of the product that you're developing. If you're orienting yourself towards more complex tool that needs larger amounts of compute or, obviously consumption of tokens, that's going to become more expensive, right? Whereas if you're kind of doing more of a traditional kind of, let's just say OpenAI style kind of prompting style business, not as complex, it's going to be significantly cheaper. So I think one of those factors in this whole gross margin conversation is the style of business and how heavy your compute requirements are when it comes to the business. And yeah, so like a Mid-Journey or someone that's producing, I don't know, like podcast content, that type of thing, it can be pretty complex, like video stuff. Whereas if I'm just prompting it and needs some like excerpt out of a law thing, it's not as heavy on the compute side. So that's one consideration, I would say. Like at Spellbook, we're also very hyper focused on understanding like the amount of actions our customers are taking on a daily basis. So if I think about forecasting where costs are actually going to be, you can generally kind of equate it because it's a consumption-based model. You can always kind of relay it back to like, how did I used to like model AWS costs? Like there's a certain amount of consumption on cloud, and you can apply the same kind of logic to an LLM. It's not a one-to-one because like tokens are kind of weird in terms of how the consumption works with most LLMs, but see how much actions are being taken across your different products. And then you can kind of maybe forecast out based off of like how you're going to grow, like where your costs are going to be. And I would say like the risk overall in terms of this industry as a whole is just the reliance on an LLM. There's probably going to be like 3 to 4 players, and they're kind of already establishing themselves as like 3 to 4 players in the industry. I think a lot of the AI companies right now are benefiting from just lower costs. A lot of these LLMs have not increased their prices. Eventually, we're going to get to this place where they're going to have pricing power just because it's an oligopoly where they're incentivized to increase prices. And that's going to impact a significant amount of startups who do not have a repeatable, scalable business that they can orient it around. So I think in order to protect your margin, you also need a business that has a high NRR or NDR. It's like, is your business able to expand? If there's high churn, you're screwed, right? You're going to kind of continually burn out and the costs are going to continue to rise. I don't think this idea of economies of scale around LLMs, that's more for like the companies providing you the service versus how they're pricing it to you. I think there's a false pretense of, yeah, we're going to take advantage of like, the benefits of scale over time. No, they own the pricing power and they're going to charge you what they feel like it's appropriate down the line. So I only think it's going to become more expensive from a COGS perspective. So maybe the way, again, I would see it as like, what are your other inputs around COGS? Is there ways to eliminate those to kind of redistribute the cost profile in a sense where, sometimes you have support costs going into COGS. Is there a way I can use a tool instead of a person to reduce my cost significantly? Or is there a piece of software that we can maybe eliminate? It's redundant, that type of thing. So I think I'd really look deeply into your cost structure as you scale in the business. But ultimately, I would say like most successful companies are gonna be the businesses that are repeatable, scalable, can expand, and kind of can eat the additional COGS in the future to continually have that free cash flow. Because generally speaking, your costs, like your OPEX, it's going to probably peak out and you can optimize for that at a certain point in time where your COGS are generally going to grow. So I would say you have to manage those expectations from that side.
Word.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think what you're talking about is basically like almost a barbell where there's going to be like $4 or $5 trillion winners. Mm-hmm. Then on the other end, there's going to be like hundreds or thousands of people who are going to be making a couple $1 million with a small team. And then it's kind of just like the middle layer, right? Of like, what do you do, right? So I do think for a lot of the operators out there, as they're thinking through scaling, building out AI, the tools, the processes are sick, but definitely need to think through the financial model as well.
Yeah. There's going to be a lot of adjacent kind of roles and things created out of this too, right? If you think about the initial onset of cloud, there's a lot of providers now that optimize your cloud costs, right? There's going to be folks that optimize your tokenization or consumption of your LLMs. So it's just, I say like maybe give it a couple years, of course, as people understand how this stuff works. But yeah, there's ways to maybe reduce some of the risk around that. But in the long term, I do think just because there's only like 4 or 5 players, you are going to get burned a little bit on COGS moving forward.
Word. I know we're close to time here. Maybe as an ending point, I've got a couple of these quicker questions, but just like what's the most unsexy thing you've had to do in your current role at Spellbook? I feel like everybody talks about the cool stuff, but I feel like no one talks about just the mundane, unglorious stuff that every single operator has had to do.
Yeah. I just went through this recently and finally done, but it's data cleansing. Literally, as a finance person, your first role is making sure your data is accurate and what you're reporting on is accurate. And so when I typically go into an organization, I spend like the first 3 months understanding where all this data sits and how we're presenting it, how it all adds up. And obviously, as an early stage company with no finance person before, that you're going to find errors. And naturally, who's going to be the one who kind of has to clean it? The finance person. And so I spent quite a bit of time doing like that grind work, which, it's just an expectation, but it took me nearly a month to clean and get that all set up and ready to go. It's unsexy for sure, but having accurate level data and that's real time reported is definitely going to benefit everyone else across the org.
Yeah. And you had to do it in the MacBook.
That was even more challenging.
Well, cool, man. Well, I appreciate you coming on the pod. This is a lot of fun. Thank you for listening to the Operators Only podcast. We put a lot of work into this. So if you're on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, wherever, hit like and subscribe, hit follow, leave a 5-star review. Makes me feel like it's not just my mom and my girlfriend that listen to this. And most importantly, please DM me any ideas that you have for how to make the show better, new guests that we should have on, new formats. I'm all ears to everything. We're trying to make this better. So if you have ideas, find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, or whatever platform and hit me up. I want to hear how you think we can make this better. And with that, I'll see you next time.